No employee dared to contradict the arrogant billionaire CEO, until the new black cook silenced him. "You have no right to speak to me that way." The voice echoed through the Whitmore Corporation executive dining room like thunder on a clear day. 200 employees simultaneously stopped chewing, his fork suspended in midair, staring in disbelief at the black woman in an apron who had just yelled at the most powerful man in the company. Richard Whitmore Jr., CEO and heir to a business empire, was paralyzed. His icy blue eyes, accustomed to instant submission, met the determined eyes of Keisha Washington. At 32, she had just done something that none of the 1,500 employees in that glass tower had ever dared to do: confront the tyrant head-on. The silence was deafening. Executive secretaries, department managers, vice presidents, all witnessed the unthinkable. The new cafeteria employee, hired just 2 weeks ago, stood before the billionaire as if she were his equal. "How dare you?" Whitmore began, his voice trembling with pure indignation. Keisha interrupted him, something no one had done in years. "I dare because someone has to. You may own this company, but you don't own people's dignity." Keisha's story had begun 3 months earlier when she was unfairly fired from her previous job. She was a trained chef, but the economic crisis had forced her to take whatever she could get. The job at the Whitmore Corp cafeteria paid the bills, but it was a far cry from her culinary dreams. In her early days, she had quietly observed the toxic dynamics of the company. Richard Whitmore Jr. treated employees like disposable objects. He yelled at assistants for inadequate coffee, humiliated managers in public meetings, and fired people for imaginary infractions. What bothered Keisha the most was how everyone accepted it. 5,000 employees groveling before a man who had inherited everything and built nothing. She had seen this dynamic before, in other jobs, but never so extreme. On that fateful day, Whitmore had appeared in the cafeteria during lunch, loudly complaining that quality was declining and that he might need to outsource the entire operation. His words were poison aimed specifically at the cafeteria employees, all of whom were black and Hispanic, as he looked directly at her. "People like this shouldn't be preparing food in a serious company," he said, pointing surreptitiously in her direction. That's when Keisha exploded. Now, at the epicenter of the storm she had created, she kept her shoulders straight. Her grandmother always said, "Those who bow their heads to the powerful will never rise up to the weak." That moment would define not only his future at the company, but who she really was. What no one there knew was that Keisha Washington was not just a cook desperate for a job. She held secrets that would make that confrontation only the first act of a revolution that would shake the entire corporation. If you're enjoying this story of courage and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happened next completely changed the rules of the game at that company. Whitmore thought he was dealing with yet another submissive employee, but he was about to discover that he had completely underestimated the woman standing in front of her. What happened in the minutes following Keisha's confrontation would set the tone for the coming months at Whitmore Corporation. Richard Whitmore Jr. was not used to being contradicted, let alone publicly humiliated by an insignificant cafeteria employee. As the cafeteria remained deathly silent, Whitmore regained his composure with the calculated coldness of someone who had learned to turn embarrassment into power. His eyes slowly scanned each face in the room, memorizing the witnesses to his humiliation. "Interesting," he muttered, adjusting the cuffs of his Italian shirt. "Very interesting indeed." In the days that followed, Whitmore's revenge began in a subtle and cruel way. Keisha arrived at work on Monday to find that his schedule had been reorganized. He would now work from 5 a.m. to 2 p.m., the hardest shift, preparing breakfast for early rising executives and lunch for 1,500 employees. "Operational issues," explained Janet, the supervisor, avoiding eye contact. "Direct orders from the board." Keisha knew it was a lie. Janet was an honest 50-year-old woman who had worked there for decades. The embarrassment in her voice revealed that she, too, was just a pawn in Whitmore's game. What Richard Whitmore Jr. didn't know was that he was dealing with someone who had survived far worse than a spoiled boss. Keisha had grown up in Detroit's most violent neighborhood, raised by a grandmother who cleaned offices at night and sold flowers on the street corner during the day. By the age of 8, she knew how to cook dinner for 3 people with $2 worth of ingredients. At 16, she worked part-time at a diner while studying cooking from books borrowed from the library. At 25, she graduated as a chef against all odds, facing teachers who questioned whether people like her had the patience necessary for haute cuisine. Whitmore thought he was dealing with an employee desperate for a job. In fact, He was provoking a woman who had turned every obstacle in her life into a stepping stone to the next level. The harassment intensified when Whitmore began showing up in the cafeteria during Keisha's shifts. He circled the tables like a predator, looking for flaws in her service. He complained that the coffee was 1 degree above ideal, that the trays were not perfectly aligned, that there was imperceptible excess salt in the food. Each complaint was directed specifically at her, in front of colleagues and customers. It was a systematic campaign of public humiliation. "It seems our new employee needs additional training," he would announce loudly, whenever there were more people around. "Perhaps we should consider stricter standards for future hires." The racial slurs were always subtle, never explicit enough to constitute a formal complaint, but too obvious to be ignored. Keisha saw colleagues lowering their heads, pretending not to hear, terrified of becoming the next target. The final straw came on a Thursday when Whitmore appeared in the cafeteria accompanied by 3 visiting executives from a partner company. He asked to speak to her, the person in charge of the kitchen, in front of everyone. "This is Keisha," he introduced with a fake smile. "Our newest acquisition. Tell our guests about her previous culinary experience, Keisha." It was a trap. If she mentioned his previous jobs in snack bars and simple restaurants, she would be ridiculed. If she lied or refused to answer, she would be fired for insubordination. Keisha looked him straight in the eye. "My experience includes turning limited ingredients into nutritious meals for hardworking people who deserve dignity and respect, Mr. Whitmore. A skill I learned at a young age and still use today." The response was so elegant and sharp that one of the visiting executives suppressed a smile. Whitmore realized he had been outmaneuvered again. "How charming," he replied, but her voice betrayed his growing irritation. "I hope that creativity translates into measurable results." That night, Keisha returned to her small apartment and did something she hadn't done in years. She called her grandmother Dolores, now 83 and still living in Detroit. "Grandma, remember when you taught me that those who sow humiliation reap a storm?" The loving voice of the woman who had raised her traveled across the miles. "Of course, my dear. Why do you ask?" "I think it's time for some people to reap what they've sown." Keisha wasn't just a talented cook. She had spent 3 years working as an assistant to a renowned investigative chef who specialized in exposing restaurants that violated health and labor standards. She knew exactly how to document irregularities in an irrefutable way. And Whitmore Corp., she was discovering, was riddled with her. While Whitmore planned his next public humiliation, Keisha began to prepare something that would turn his small act of defiance into a storm that would wipe out much more than just an arrogant CEO. What no one in that cafeteria could have imagined was that the woman they had seen confront a billionaire was not just defending her dignity. She was gathering information for a war Whitmore never saw coming. Keisha's investigation began meticulously the following morning. Arriving at 4:30 a.m., an hour before his official shift, she had free access to the empty corridors of the corporation. What she discovered in the first few days left her appalled. The cafeteria kitchen was violating at least 15 basic health regulations. Equipment with unreported gas leaks, freezers operating at inappropriate temperatures, expired ingredients being reused with falsified labels. Even more serious, the cleaning staff, all immigrants, worked without adequate protective equipment with highly toxic chemicals. Keisha discreetly photographed everything. Every irregularity, every document, every defective piece of equipment. Her experience with the investigative chef had taught her exactly which agencies to contact and how to build an irrefutable case. Meanwhile, Whitmore intensified his campaign of humiliation. In the second week of his persecution, he brought a group of Japanese investors to see the company's operations. He made a point of passing through the cafeteria during peak hours. "This is her culinary team," he announced loudly, gesturing toward Keisha. "We are always experimenting with different approaches to cost reduction." The subliminal message was clear: Black and Hispanic employees were cheap experimentation compared to previous standards. The investors, embarrassed, exchanged uncomfortable glances. Keisha held her head high, continuing to serve with impeccable professionalism. But that night, she added more photographs to his growing file. Her true ally appeared unexpectedly. Patricia Coleman, the company's internal auditor, had noticed strange movements in the cafeteria's financial reports. A 48-year-old black woman with a degree in accounting from Harvard, she held one of the few leadership positions in the company that had been earned through pure competence. "Keisha," she whispered during a break in the hallway. "We need to talk." They met at a small cafe 6 blocks from the company. Patricia revealed devastating information. Whitmore was overcharging the cafeteria, declaring fictitious expenses, and pocketing the difference. Worse still, he had been doing this for 3 years. "I found out by accident when I was auditing supplier contracts," Patricia explained, sliding a discreet folder across the table. 40% of the reported expenses are fictitious. We're talking about fraud in the millions of dollars. Keisha opened the folder. Detailed spreadsheets showed alarming discrepancies between products purchased and reported values. Premium equipment that cost the price of basic items, special organic ingredients that were actually conventional products with inflated profit margins. "Why is it he's showing me this?" Keisha asked. "Because you were the first person in years to stand up to that man," Patricia replied, her eyes shining with admiration. "And because I know you have a background in food auditing. I saw his resume when he was hired." Patricia didn't know Keisha's plan, but she was providing exactly the weapons she needed. Corporate fraud was a federal crime, much more serious than health violations. In the days that followed, Whitmore made his most serious mistake. During a meeting with directors, deliberately held in the cafeteria to maximize humiliation, he made explicitly racist comments about the limited intellectual capacity of employees of certain backgrounds to deal with sophisticated corporate standards. What he didn't know was that Keisha had hidden his cell phone behind the napkin dispenser, recording every word. 25 minutes of incriminating content, including laughter and agreement from other executives. That night, Keisha meticulously organized her evidence. She had photographs of the health violations, documents of financial fraud provided by Patricia, a recording of the racist comments, and a detailed list of witnesses willing to testify. But she needed something more. Something that would make Whitmore's downfall not just legal, but publicly devastating. The answer came when she discovered that he was running for the National Business Association's Ethical CEO of the Year award. The ceremony would be broadcast live, with national press coverage. Keisha smiled for the first time in weeks. It wouldn't just be about justice. It would be about perfect timing. The following Friday, Whitmore showed up in the cafeteria accompanied by a film crew. He was producing a promotional video on inclusive leadership for her award nomination. He specifically asked to film natural interactions with our diverse operational team. When he approached Keisha with his fake politician smile, she replied with poisonous sweetness, "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. It will be a pleasure to show how things really work here." What he interpreted as submission was actually the deadly calm of someone who knew exactly when the hammer would fall. Keisha had timed her move for the following Tuesday, during the live award ceremony. Whitmore thought he was filming his victory. In fact, he was documenting the last 48 hours of his career. The Ethical CEO of the Year award ceremony was being broadcast live across the country. In the elegant ballroom of the Metropolitan Hotel, 500 executives, journalists, and political figures awaited the presentation of the most prestigious award in American business. Richard Whitmore Jr., impeccably dressed in a designer tuxedo, chatted animatedly with reporters in the front row. Her confidence was absolute. She had discreetly bribed 2 members of the judging committee and manipulated financial figures to appear the perfect candidate. "Our company represents the future of inclusive management," he declared to the cameras, his political smile rehearsed. "We believe that diversity is not only morally right, but strategically smart." 5 blocks away, Keisha Washington was putting the finishing touches on her plan. She was not at the event, but she had sensed something much more powerful than her physical presence: the truth. 3 hours before the ceremony, Patricia Coleman had personally delivered a folder containing devastating evidence to the president of the National Business Association. Photographs of health violations, documents of accounting fraud, and a 25-minute recording of Whitmore's explicit racist comments. "We believe the public deserves to know the real candidate," Patricia said coldly as she handed over the material. The association's president, James Morrison, was a man of integrity who had built her reputation on advocating corporate transparency. As he reviewed the evidence, his face grew progressively paler. "My God," he murmured, looking at the photographs of spoiled food being reused. "This is criminal." The audio recording was the final blow. Whitmore's unmistakable voice echoed through the office. "People like this should not be preparing food in a serious company. Certain backgrounds, limited intellectual capacity." Morrison immediately called an emergency committee meeting. The decision was unanimous. Whitmore would be publicly exposed during the live broadcast. Back in the hall, the ceremony proceeded as normal. Whitmore had been called to the stage and was speaking about family values and social responsibility, when Morrison discreetly walked up the side, carrying a tablet and a wireless microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison interrupted, her voice echoing through the speakers. "Before we proceed with the awards, we have received information that I feel is essential to share with all of you." Whitmore froze mid-sentence. Something in Morrison's tone alerted him to the impending danger. The cameras automatically focused on the association president. "We have just received documented evidence that one of the award nominees is involved in corporate fraud, serious health code violations, and systematic racial discrimination." A murmur rippled through the audience. Whitmore tried to keep his smile, but sweat began to form on her forehead. Morrison connected the tablet to the sound system. "With the viewer's permission, we consider it essential that you hear these legally obtained recordings." Whitmore's voice filled the hall, amplified by professional speakers. Every racist word, every degrading comment, every knowing laugh from his executives echoed through the 500 guests in absolute silence. People like that shouldn't be preparing food, certain backgrounds, limited intellectual capacity. The cameras captured every second of the humiliation. Whitmore's face gradually changed from the pink of shame to the white of pure terror. He tried to approach the microphone to explain himself, but Morrison stopped her with a firm gesture. "The photographs you are about to see were taken in the Whitmore Corp kitchen a week ago." On the giant screen behind the stage, shocking images followed one after another. Expired ingredients with falsified labels, equipment with dangerous leaks, employees without protective equipment handling toxic chemicals. And here we have the financial documents proving systematic fraud of $3 million in fictitious supply contracts for the corporate cafeteria. Whitmore tried to flee the stage, but Morrison remained relentless. "Richard Whitmore, Jr., you are publicly disqualified from this award. Furthermore, this evidence will be forwarded immediately to the Federal Prosecutor's Office for criminal investigation." The hall erupted. Camera flashes went off simultaneously. Reporters shouted questions. Executives who moments before had been greeting Whitmore now moved away as if he had a contagious disease. Whitmore tried one last gambit, approaching the microphone with trembling hands. "This is a conspiracy. A setup. I built my company from scratch, created jobs, contributed to the economy." Morrison interrupted him coldly. "Mr. Whitmore, his company was built on disguised slave labor and documented fraud. The only jobs you've really created are for the lawyers who will need to defend you." As security guards escorted him out of the hall, Whitmore shouted desperately, "Who did this to me? Who provided these lies?" Morrison smiled for the first time that night. "A courageous employee you tried to humiliate, Mr. Whitmore. Someone who proved that integrity has no color, social class, or price." 3 kilometers away, Keisha watched the live broadcast in the small apartment she shared with 2 colleagues. When she saw Whitmore being escorted away in utter humiliation, she did not feel sadistic pleasure. She felt justice. His phone rang. It was Patricia. "Keisha, you need to see the news. All the major networks are covering the story. And there's more. The board of directors wants to meet with you tomorrow." What no one expected was that Whitmore's downfall would be just the first domino in a series of events that would completely transform not only a company, but an entire industry. The woman he tried to break was about to become the most powerful force that corporate world had ever known. The board meeting the next morning was historic. 12 members of Whitmore Corp's senior management gathered for an emergency session to discuss the wreckage left by the live broadcast that had gone viral on social media with over 5 million views in just 18 hours. Keisha entered the executive meeting room for the first time in her life. The same environment where employees were humiliated and fired on Whitmore's whims now welcomed her as a hero. Margaret Thompson, chair of the board and the only woman among the directors, led the conversation. "Miss Washington, first we want to formally apologize for the toxic environment we allowed to thrive under our supervision," Thompson said, her voice laden with genuine embarrassment. "Second, we want to offer you the position of Director of Culinary Operations for the entire corporation, with a salary of $250,000 a year." The offer was 10 times his previous salary. But Keisha had bigger plans. "I accept the position, but with conditions," she replied. placing a folder on the mahogany table. First, immediate implementation of an anti-discrimination training program for all executives. Second, creation of a permanent employee committee to report irregularities without retaliation. Third, preferential hiring of professionals from marginalized communities for leadership positions. Thompson smiled for the first time. Approved. All approved. Meanwhile, Richard Whitmore Jr. faced the perfect storm that her arrogance had created. On the Monday following the broadcast, the federal prosecutor's office filed 17 criminal charges against him: corporate fraud, tax evasion, labor violations, and systematic racial discrimination. His lawyers estimated that he would face between 15 and 20 years in federal prison. Worse still, her reputation was completely destroyed. Videos of her public humiliation went viral, with compilations of her facial expressions during the exposure racking up millions of views. The fall was even more brutal financially. Shareholders filed a class action lawsuit, demanding compensation for losses caused by mismanagement. Partner companies terminated multi-million-dollar contracts. Whitmore Corp's stock value plummeted 72% in 1 week. Whitmore was forced to sell her $20 million mansion, her classic car collection, and even her yacht to pay for lawyers and court settlements. A man who humiliated employees for inadequate standards now lived in a modest apartment, drove a used sedan, and faced looks of recognition and contempt wherever he went. The transformation at the company was revolutionary. With Keisha leading the changes, the cafeteria became a national model of excellence. She implemented a culinary training program for employees, offered scholarships for culinary courses, and created a promotion system based exclusively on merit. Patricia Coleman was promoted to CFO, becoming the first black woman to hold an executive position in the company's history. Janet, the supervisor who had always treated Keisha with respect, was appointed general manager of operations. Dozens of employees who had previously lived in fear now held leadership positions in his departments. 6 months later, Business Weekly magazine published a cover story on the Whitmore Revolution, highlighting how a company on the brink of ethical collapse had become a benchmark for diversity and inclusion under new leadership. The change began when one courageous employee decided that dignity was non-negotiable, wrote the lead journalist. Keisha Washington proved that one person willing to fight can transform not only her own life, but an entire corporate culture. Public recognition came when Keisha was invited to speak at the National Congress on Workplace Discrimination. Her speech, watched by more than 10 million people, went viral with the phrase, "We don't have to accept disrespect to keep our jobs. We need to create jobs that respect who we are." Universities began inviting her to teach courses on ethical leadership. Companies across the country requested her consulting services to transform their work environments. Keisha had become a national symbol of corporate courage. The most powerful moment came during a business conference a year after the scandal. Keisha was on the main stage when someone in the audience shouted, "What if you're wrong? What if some people really don't deserve certain opportunities?" Keisha smiled with the confidence of someone who had proven his point beyond dispute. "If it is his mistake, how does he explain that our company's productivity increased 40% after we stopped wasting energy humiliating talented people? How does he explain that our revenue hit historic highs when we started promoting based on competence rather than family connections?" The audience erupted in applause. The question had been answered not with words, but with measurable results. A year after the initial confrontation, Keisha returned to the cafeteria where it all began. It was now his office, decorated with certificates of recognition and photographs of all the employees who had been promoted under her management. Through the window, she could see Richard Whitmore Jr. waiting for the bus on the street. He now worked as a salesman in a small electronics store, earning in a month what he had previously spent on a single meal. His billionaire friends had completely abandoned him when the scandals became public. Her ex-wife had filed for divorce, taking half of his remaining assets. His children, ashamed of their father, had changed their last name. Keisha felt no pity, but she also felt no hatred. She felt something much more powerful, the certainty that she had used her voice to protect hundreds of people who had no voice. Patricia entered his office with a stack of resumes. "We have 300 applications for the supervisory positions," she announced with a smile. 80% are from women and ethnic minorities. It seems his story has inspired a lot of people to try something new. "Perfect," replied Keisha, leafing through the documents. "Let's give each of these people the chance they deserve." At that moment, his phone rang. It was an invitation to dinner at the White House, where she would be honored as one of the transformative leaders of the decade. The little girl who 3 years earlier had washed dishes to survive was now receiving recognition from the highest echelons of government. The most important lesson in Keisha Washington's story is not about revenge, but about transformative courage. She teaches us that a person willing to fight for justice can take on any system, no matter how powerful. Her story proves that dignity is priceless, that respect cannot be bought, and that sometimes the difference between oppression and freedom lies in the courage to say one word, no. Richard Whitmore thought he was dealing with just another disposable employee. He discovered too late that he had provoked a force of nature that would turn his arrogance into a life lesson for the whole world. He tried to destroy her, but ended up destroying only himself, while she built a legacy that will last for generations. Today, when young professionals face discrimination in their jobs, many remember Keisha's story and find the courage to take action. She proved that we don't have to accept injustice to survive. We can, in fact, turn injustice into a revolution that benefits not only ourselves, but everyone who comes after us. Keisha's true revenge was not to humiliate Whitmore publicly. It was to prove that he was completely wrong about her abilities, about her value as a human being. The best revenge will always be success built on the rubble of the prejudice of those who tried to diminish us. If this story of courage and transformation touched his heart, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to remember that a courageous voice can change the whole world. Because sometimes, all it takes to bring down the system is one person willing to speak the truth, even when the whole world prefers silence. Leave a comment if you have faced a similar situation and how you reacted. Her story can inspire others to find their own courage.